Great. Yep. Okay. All right. I think probably everyone can hear me. Hey, everyone in the chat, can you hear me right now?
Nev said that 6 people confirmed.
Okay, cool. All right. Someone in the chat, let me know if you can hear me. I know there's a delay here. All right. That looks good. There's a lot of tech to set up here. All right. I got more people coming in. Yes. I will give you the link. Actually, I'll throw that in the. I should probably mute myself on the call or on Hey everyone, give me a thumbs up if you can hear us. I think we are good to go. I'm just going to wait for a response here and then I'll jump into the intro. Okay, it looks like we're live.
Oh no, I lost you.
We're still here. And we can see you.
Okay, I'm in some other screen realm.
All right.
Okay.
All right, I'll just dive into the intro here. I think everyone can hear us. If you see my lips moving and you can't hear me, I am not trying something new. The audio is probably not working. So, all right, cool. Welcome. This is our second live Q&A with the Future Thinkers podcast guests. Today we have Nora Bateson with us. We did an interview in October 2019 in episodes 106 and 107. You can actually find those by going to futurethinkers.org/the-number. And we wanted to take the conversation further and include our community in it as well. So Nora Bateson is an award-winning filmmaker, writer, educator, and the president of the International Bateson Institute. She comes from a family lineage of complexity thinkers. Her father was a systems theorist, Gregory Bateson. This is why I don't usually do this live. And her grandfather was the biologist William Bateson, who coined the term genetics. So Nora's book, Small Arcs of Larger Circles, came out in 2016, and she's currently working on her next book about warm data. Her work brings the fields of biology, cognition, art, anthropology, psychology, and information technology together into a study of the patterns in ecology of living systems. So Nora, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So we spoke briefly the other day, and it kind of naturally, the first thing that came up was what the news headlines were, I think, on January 3rd of the attack in Iran and the response of Iran, and then all of this talk. I was seeing headlines just scrolling all the way down Reddit of World War III, and so I figured we can't really proceed with the conversation without addressing what's going on in the world, where we feel like we're headed. So, what are your thoughts?
I think that if I had any thoughts that were very clear and defined right now, that you should probably just hang up on me. That this isn't the time to have really ossified those positions yet. At the same time, I think, what do we do now? That's kind of where I am, is this question of what do we do now? Where are we now? And it's Iran, certainly, but it's also the news of the 1 billion animals that have died in the fires in Australia, and our friends there that are relocating and wondering how to live in a prolonged emergency situation. It's also, I'm living in Sweden. I'm watching the political landscape shape into something I never dreamed of. I was with my kids and friends on New Year's thinking, well, where were we a decade ago when it was about to be the year 2010? And, at that moment, Obama had just been elected, and we had just had the economic crash, and it was a very different world. It seemed like there were different horizons than there are now. And I guess I don't remember who that sci-fi writer was that first coined that fantastic phrase of "the future's not what it used to be." But I think that for me, that's an important piece of this, because what we're looking at is how systems change is changing systems change. and it's a very serious moment of things changing so quickly in so many different contextual processes that it's confusing. And I think that confusion is in itself both something terrifying and maybe something hopeful. The strings are coming loose. um, the structures are melting. So what's happening? I don't know how it will come out, but here we are. What do you think?
Well, at the risk of sounding utopian or trying to slap on a silver lining to this, I do feel like the whole political issue that America has been facing the last 4 years highlights the need for something new and something that really addresses the complexity and the actual problems that we face now and coming up in the future. And just the other day, I shared a really good interview with Andrew Yang, and I thought it was great. His whole platform is based off of this basic income idea, and I felt like he had addressed so many things, and it was just, he seems like such a contrast to what we've seen in the last 4 years with Trump. So, you know, I don't feel like he would be as successful or even have a chance if we didn't have the contrast. You know what I mean? So I feel like Trump has provided something in this.
I mean, I think everything has provided something, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's something that in this, when Trump was first elected, the impact for me and my kids and kind of just in looking at it was something like, remember the scene in Princess Bride when the grandson is hearing the story and somebody dies and he says, wait a minute, that's not how the story goes. There's something that had that moment of like, wait a minute, no, that can't happen. And the realization is like, if this is happening, that means that I don't understand what's really happening. Like it seems like there should be, where's the hero rushing on the stage fixing this problem? And then it sort of occurs to me, I think that's me, except it's not that stage, right? Somehow it's not Andrew Yang, and it's not Marianne Williamson, and it's not a person in a position who's going to fix it for us. And somehow this sense that is the solution is now obviously bankrupt. And so in some way, the news sort of just reminds me of that on an ongoing basis. There's something to do. And the thought, whenever I heard that, especially Nora, when you mentioned the Australian brush fires, is that, you know, a lot of people denying climate change, or, you know, you can't deny the number of refugees and it's going to increase. And the question is, what's the counterpart to a refugee? How do I actually be an involved citizen before I'm displaced, right? And that, in order to engage this meaningfully, and the question is a real one and an individual one. And like you said, if I had an answer, I would have to check my sanity, because it's not simple.
Yeah. I think good.
But it isn't only in Trump 4 years ago or 3 years ago. I mean, we just had a UK election, which is just as disturbing in a lot of ways. And so it's almost like we're, hurtling towards this place where these two things are going to have to collide. And it seems like it's just really frightening.
I've had an interesting experience this year that maybe pertains to this, which is that I've been doing a lot of these warm data labs around the world. And what happens in a warm data lab is that there's the opportunity to explore a complex issue through a lot of different contexts in a group form. And so it seems very simple to sort of walk in the door to participate in a warm data lab. You wouldn't think that it's really all that much going on in it, but actually there's quite a bit of deeper theory and process happening. But if you were to just walk in the room, it would look like this. We would have a question that might look something like, what is well-being in a changing world, or what is health in a changing world? Or I like to put in a changing world in there because it keeps the time part moving. Um, and it's always a what question, because if you have a how question, you go immediately to action without that moment first of referencing and reflecting on how that sense is being made, which is really important. And then there would be lots of contexts laid out and different places where you could go and sit and talk with people. And those contexts might look like education, economy, politics, health, religion, media, technology, things like that. And then you would go around and have conversations about this question: what is health in a changing world? And as you are sitting in your, let's say, the education station, you're sitting there with a few people and you start talking, and who knows what they're going to say. They could say anything, right? What is health in the context of education in a changing world? What does that bring up for you? And strangely, it brings up really different things for different people. And so those conversations start to spark ideas and connections. And after a little while, you move as an individual. No one rings a bell or says it's time to go or anything. You go when you want to go, where you want to go. And you might go over to culture or to politics or to economy. And then you'd sit down with another group of people who are in mid conversation, and you have to put on your anthropologist hat for a second as you come into that conversation. Where are they? What are they talking about? Who are they? Why are they talking about this? How does this fit into who I am? And what was I just talking about? And so gradually you can see that as you start to change context, these layers grow and grow, to where there's actually quite a significant amount of both detail and multi-contextual process happening in the simplest conversation between 5 or 6 people about whatever, their kid's third grade teacher, or the bank account they didn't open, or maybe it's some geopolitical theory or a philosophical piece of history, or whatever it is that comes out in the conversation. Um, and what I have witnessed in doing this process around the world this year is that the people who have the least amount of um, comfort, maybe of education, of established influence in the existing system, those people have the swiftest capacity to enter into and engage in complexity at the most significant levels. So I think that's important because one of the things you were saying, Mike, is that this is the time when we really have to be dealing with complexity, and and the the little ghost that pops in the room when you say that is whispering things like, yeah, but that's a very elitist thing to say, because you have to have an education, that complexity is only available to we, the select few who've read the right books and studied the right theories, and and um, and that is just not true. Working with people who are homeless, working with kids, working with um, people who've never even heard of systems theory or complexity, and they are able to not only adopt but take on these ideas and move them forward so fast. So I just want to mention that because I, I want to be very clear about something that has always been sort of the case in my own lifetime, which is that, we are complex systems. Thinking and doing complexity is not really that difficult. It's just that it's not given a space. So the familiarity with the possibility to do that is something that I think is really valuable right now and opens up a lot of hope.
So who are the participants in Warm Data Labs? How do they find you? How do you find them?
Yeah, there's lots of different ways in which that happens. Sometimes it's by invitation, sometimes it's inside an organization, sometimes I just get brought into a crisis situation or a post-crisis situation. And it's the people who happen to be there. So it really, that's a kind of a moving target. It's some sort of magic of, at this point, people who've heard of Warm Data, and I happen to be able to be there, or one of the other certified hosts can be there, and it just kind of happens. So, sorry, that's not a very satisfying answer, but that's the truth.
Yeah, thanks. And then how? I guess that you were devising this process on the go through the practice, like how to work with such different groups of people, how to set up the ground for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the real setup, the actual structure of the lab itself is, like I said, there's a lot of theoretical pinnings in it, but you would never notice them from the outside. And what it really relies on is that people will show up and just talk about their own experience. And it doesn't really matter if they're experts or PhDs or, where they are in the political spectrum or what culture they come from or how old they are. Everybody has something to learn and to contribute and a voice in that. So it just kind of happens, which is really great. Yeah. I
started responding to you and then realized I was muted. But when you were talking about how more people are able to participate in this than what is perceived to be the educated elite, I completely agree. And I've seen that so much in traveling, like in little villages, even in Thailand. I've had these types of conversations with kind of random young people, and it just flows just in the same way that it would in Europe or in North America. I live in Bulgaria. I can have these conversations here. Any of the conferences that we go to, it's like, yes, there's maybe a slightly elevated level of awareness, but that in the level of complexity that we face in the world, it's not really that advantageous to know about all the current events or all the current studies or all the things that are happening right now. I agree with you. So many people have so much to offer. And really, I think the only thing that trips anyone up is how sovereign they are or how likely they are to get triggered before the conversation is able to progress. To me, that's the one roadblock. It's not education.
Yeah, and some kind of sort of authorized rivalry of positioning. And I mean, I hate to say that, but that's there of, well, what do you have to contribute? And how much complexity can you see? And, are you qualified to do this? And I would love to see us move on from that, particularly in this community, right here, right now, to kind of go to that warmer place of recognizing, there's no cleverer than thou now. We actually just need to do some work and help each other keep our eyes open. I mean, I think the thing is that there's so many epistemological traps. So sometimes I work with environmental activists, and they can get really in that conversation. It can become very binary, and that's a trap. And then sometimes, bringing in people who are working more in embodied knowing and that frame of even mindfulness, and that can actually become a trap. And then working with people who are in politics and and certainly there's all sorts of traps in there. And just kind of recognizing that we're all in this matrix, and there's blind spots all over the place. So, you know, anyone who sort of is coming in with their eyes open and ready to catch those blind spots. I mean, that's, for me, that's the main thing right now, of just, I know there's things I don't see, but do I have friends around me who can help me be confused when I need to be confused?
A couple of comments from the comment section. Ben says, I experience complexity paralysis when I feel I'm not being able to hold everything in mind. Things are not black and white, feeling unable to move forward. Yeah. How do you deal with that?
Well, my feeling about that, I like that. I like that as a term, complexity paralysis. Hi, how you doing today? Oh, I'm okay. How are you? Oh, I'm all right. I got complexity paralysis, but you know, maybe by lunchtime I'll be better. But that's kind of how it is, you know. I think when I have complexity paralysis, it's because I haven't quite seen it, felt it, found it yet. And then when something comes loose and I can really perceive something surprising in the thing that I'm working with, that complexity paralysis dissipates. But those moments are golden, and it's really easy to miss them if you don't know what you're looking for. And so I really relate to that conundrum of I want to embrace the complexity, but I don't want to drown in it and just get lost. And then how do I ever decide to take any action ever? And where's the edge of the system when it just has systems and more systems? And the next thing you know, it's the whole universe. And, you know, you could have warm data in, you know, the entire Library of Congress and still not understand a single family, right? So, on the other hand, there is another piece to that, which is that it's surprising how once the perception shifts, and this is what I'm seeing in the labs, there's a deepening that comes immediately with another kind of integrity. And it's not an integrity of knowing what's right or wrong. It's an integrity of paying attention to the interdependencies that you're operating within. So you see them, where in your first question, your first sort of dilemma, your first intrigue into the whatever it was, the wicked problem, if you want, you didn't really have that. And then pretty soon those questions go further, and they stretch past where you thought. So one time we did one with a group of people, and the question at first was about how to, we did a warm day, I think it was on health, like the one I just described to you. And one of the questions that was looming in the room was a question around how to produce chocolate without slavery, right? That's a good question, right? That's a question that has a lot of context and some systems work in it and so on and so forth. And then by the end of the day, the question shifted from how to produce chocolate without slavery to where's the edge of our responsibility, right? That's a very different question that is going to bring insight and action to a very different pattern of possibilities. And so it's a significant jump from a kind of linear positioning to a wider question that is going to produce all kinds of new relationships and nonlinear processes and totally blur the edges of the notion of roles, which I think is really important. So that's just an example, but maybe that helps. I don't know.
Oh, I really like this question. Like, where's the edge of my responsibility? Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah, because like thinking about all the things happening in the world can be like extremely overwhelming. And yeah, like I try to, as much as I can, just focus on like the things that I can personally influence. Like if I can't influence Iran, I just don't think about it. Like, what's the point?
Mhm.
Yeah.
But it's super hard, and like so many people can say that you're a bad person if you're not actively interested in Iran and Australia and all the other things that are happening around the world. But like in the end, there's just like one question: can I do something about it, or like what's the most important thing that I can be responsible for?
Well, I guess I see that as a piece of this that is an invitation to do that zoom in, but also to zoom out. And so in that lab, when we got to that question, where it led to was really to a sort of a different kind of question, which is really more about how do we feed the babies? How does the next generations um, begin to be taken into account? Okay, so that's major, because that doesn't just mean that my clothes are not made by slaves. It means that the people who make my clothes can feed their children. And that's a difference. You see, that's a nonlinear movement into a type of responsibility that previously, even in free trade, that just wasn't really there. There was a linear, responsible process. And so I think that it's exciting to think about um, things in that way, and to watch how that thinking and those perceptions at that level, how it changes everything in your life, in the individual day, at the individual level, but also what kind of possibilities open up for how you might take part in the questions around Iran or around what's happening in Australia. That right now, of course, if you look at it, it's like, well, what can I do? That's just, over there somewhere. But the reality is that we are all taking part in the system that we are within, and participating even in the way we structure a sentence that we say to our children. Right? It's that minutia, but also that at that macro level that's where the change is, I think. It's not really at the macro level only. Yeah.
This recurring thing keeps coming up for me, especially in the podcast that we're doing, that it's not about finding the best answers, it's about finding the right questions. And that's what makes an interesting content piece, but that's also, to me, really relevant to what we're talking about here, about how and what do I have control over. It's like that places the imperative of context, of relevancy on the person asking the question. It's like, is this relevant to me? What's the best question I can ask that is relevant to what I have control over, rather than what do I do about the situation in Iran or Australia? The answer doesn't really allow you to do much. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but it's just a feeling I keep getting over and over.
Yeah, there's I like that thought that the questions are important, and there's something, Nora, that as you're speaking, there's something that makes me think that it's a practice of testing the edges of my boundaries of responsibility on the upper end and on the lower end at the same time. That there's something of the temptation. I've thought of the question many times. What would you do if you could not fail? I think it's a bad question at the end of the day. It's like, what would I do even if I were guaranteed to fail? It's so important that the failure, I can withstand the failure, because that's where I'm going to learn. I know that I need to do that. And so there's something of putting my ideas to the test to actually encounter that complexity and not try to shield myself from it. There's something, you know, it's funny. I watched the Bill Gates documentary on Netflix, the Inside Bill's Brain, and I was inspired by his brilliance and the sight of his vision, and really unsettled by the amount of focus on symptoms. And it's like it's that huge one central context. If we can just define the one central context that we can then solve everything, then all the problems are resolved. And it's like, I love what you said about including all of the complexities, all of the contexts and the warm data, and see what arises right here in the personal, in this moment. So it feels like I don't want to demonize Bill Gates. I don't want to say that's a bad thing to do, but I don't want to get fixated on that. And I don't want to get fixated on my own delusional grandeur ideas of how to fix it, but really practice and learn to notice where am I personally not meeting that, and where am I trying to escape that, or something like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's that simultaneous zoom in and zoom out. Somebody had asked a question about rigor in the thread, and for me that's where some of the rigor comes in, is not resting in one context and saying, oh well, you know, this is the edge of my role, this is what I'm supposed to do, so I'm just going to do what I'm supposed to do. As a mom, this is my responsibility, right? I'm not just a mom. I'm also a woman. I'm also you know, my generation. I'm also a systems thinker. I'm also concerned about the state of the ecosystems that we live within. I'm also, you know, there's a lot of things right now that, and I think this is actually an important piece here, because we're seeing quite a bit as this decade begins of the voice of the younger generations, and the beginning of going beyond what the role of a parent once was, or the role of a spouse once was, or the role of a doctor, or the role of the teacher, or the role of the police person, or the role of any of those roles are just simply not enough. If everybody stays in their role, we're going to be in big trouble. So that means that there's a need to go where we're not actually authorized to go, right? Which is all sorts of trouble. There are all kinds of legal processes put in place to stop exactly this from happening. And yet, if you are, let's say, working with a young person who's having trouble, you're going to get a particular set of descriptions of that person from the teacher that they're in class with. Then those descriptions will be limited by the role of the teacher. So that's an academic description, that's a classroom behavior description, that's that description. Then you might have a counselor, and the counselor might have a different set of descriptions. The counselor's limitations are based on various diagnostic behaviors and possibilities for all sorts of different labels for what that might be. Then you could have a police person, the police description, and that's going to be based on legality and illegality, what behaviors fall into those things. And then at some point you have to ask, who is seeing the child? Who's seeing the kid? And so this is the point, is that if each of these delegated roles and responsibilities is confined, we're in big trouble, but there's no way to get out of lockstep over the cliff that we're headed. So in order to get to the complexity, we're going to have to step into this unauthorized, blurry territory of what happens beyond your role in whatever modality that's happening. And there's a lot of rigor there, because, I'm not a nurse. I'm not a lawyer. right? I'm not trained in those professions. I don't have credibility or authorization to speak in those realms. And yet, if we don't start opening that liminal space between, that's where life actually is. So how are we going to respond to the real complexity of life? I mean, look at your own identity. Who are you? Are you a tax number? Yeah. Are you a physical body with, DNA heritage that goes into, lines in the past? Yep. Are you your education? For sure. Are you your culture? Yes. Are you your profession? Yeah. Are you your, your best friend's best friend? I hope so. Who are you? Are you your generation? So we are all these things simultaneously. And yet then there's this kind of weird compartmentalization of, now we're going to solve this problem using only this lens or only that lens. And then sometimes we bring all the people in the room together, hoping that we're going to get a holistic, integrated viewpoint. And instead, what you get is a kaleidoscope. and and so there's this, that's sort of in that question of where's the edge of my responsibility. There's that push into the rigor of, this didn't used to be your responsibility, but now it is.
I'd love to push into that a bit more about what you think, excuse me, the source of that need or desire for certainty and borders is. I made a video recently about identity exploring this exact subject, but I don't know that I was able to come up with enough to satisfy me, enough reasons that we actually want things to be binary or certain. I'd love to dive into that.
What do you guys think?
I think that one of the thoughts is that it's developmental. I think that my thought is that humans are born into a kind of a larval stage. There's so much room for development that the whittling down of who I am into an identity is the first half of my life, and then learning to apply that is kind of the second half. But I think that we got stuck in that first half. Like I notice one of the things that I pay attention to is one of the major changes that I've made that's made the most difference is stop paying attention to any news. Like I don't pay attention to any mainstream news, and it's like I get what I need from friends and whatever, but there's something I'm noticing more specifically. What is it that I care about, and that does tend to widen that question of who I am and what answers there are that are possible, not narrowing in. I notice there's something like fatigue that happens when it's like two phase. One is that focus on the problems. This is the problem as portrayed by media, and the other is I can't do anything about it. So I'm simultaneously occupied and helpless. And taking that out of the loop allows me to say, okay, wait a minute. No, look around me. There's all these things I can do something about. So let me work on these things. So that seems like a big part of it is how to reclaim my attention. Yeah, be responsible for my attention first.
Fear comes up. I mean, I think that's a big one. I mean, we want the world to make sense, and then people offer ideologies or ways of thinking about the world that at the minimum excuse us from taking any responsibility for it. So we engage in that simulated thinking, taking on these ideologies. The whole postmodernism thing is a pretty good example of that. Most of the popular ideologies that get spread like memes seem to have that component to it of you're not responsible, don't worry about it, it's someone else, which then sets up that border.
I'm really curious about how delving into complexity and opening up to all the liminality and all the dimensionality of real complexity affects people and affects identity. Like if I go into complexity asking the question, instead of how can we feed the babies, if I'm asking how can we feed our babies, like if my identity is such that I can only see within my in-group, and I only see that as important. Will opening up to complexity lead me to broaden the question, or will I simply be using these tools to create externalities because I disregard other groups? Like, is there something about going into complexity that naturally breaks down these barriers, or can we navigate in complexity with narrow motives successfully?
Oh, that's a really painful question. And there was a time when I would have actually thought that it was, that if you were working in complexity, that eventually you would end up with some sort of more holistic view, that it would happen. I don't think that anymore. I think maybe this is I could get in really big trouble for saying what I'm going to say right now, but that's okay, right? We're here together. I think maybe one of the best systems thinkers and complexity thinkers we have right now is Steve Bannon. And I don't say that lightly. So can these ideas be used to formulate and justify making walls between people? Yeah, they can. They can. And it's a matter, I think for me, that's why warm data was so important, because what I started to see happening with complexity theory and systems theory is it was getting more and more based in more engineering types of models. And it becomes easier to find a need to externalize explicitly what's happening in the complexity. And that explicit externalization and expression, I think, really undermines a great deal of what's actually happening beyond where our language can go. And when we're in our boardrooms and we're in action strategy planning mode, it becomes an imperative that you can actually use the explicit verbal model realm to say why whatever project you have in mind is going to work. And the second you go there, there's a vast amount of the actual complexity that you're dealing with that gets invisibilized and is undermined. So I hate to say it, but I think that there are some people out there who really do understand that, and they're not asking for KPIs and deliverables. They're asking for culture change. And the structure change, the policy change comes later. The deeper epistemological shifts, you can't measure them. You can't find the edge of them. There's no way to describe them. You don't know how to control them, but you can create conditions in which they are brewed, like bacteria or something. And there's been some people who have been really good at that lately. And so anyway, I hate to say that because I know that's a very, very dark thing to say. On the other hand, look, I don't think we have any time for superficial hopefulness right now. If we're going to generate hope, let it be a hope that is a little more profound. And so it's one of my great frustrations is that I have definitely felt that there's been a kind of knee-jerk appetite for hope that didn't care how superficial or unsystemic that hope was. So I guess there it is. Sorry.
No, that's good.
Actually, I actually
I-
like that you mentioned that. There's something, like I noticed in myself, I didn't say this right away, but when I said, oh, when Trump was elected, I had this kind of, oh my God, what happened? How do we fix this moment? But the recognition really is that I know that a lot of people in the country felt the same way when Obama was elected.
Mm.
And Bannon was like paying attention to those people and saying, these people don't have a voice, really. And that's, there's something I think that the people that Bannon's speaking to and the answers that they want to hear is we have much more in common with them than we think. And it's not so much who's the right person to have an office, but how do we actually address? I mean, in a sense, it's like it's a weird, because it feels like it's weaponized in that way of, oh yeah, I hear you, and here's the answer. We'll put Trump in the White House, and that'll fix it. It's like, no, that's still going back to the old style of doing that, but it's hearing a part of the population that didn't feel like their voice was heard. I mean, in a way, it might feel to them like finally we have our own. I'm going to abuse this term, but we have our own warm data lab, right? We have somebody who will listen to us. But then it's like, okay, what we do with that is point you in this direction, rather than saying, how do you actually listen to yourself? That's something like, does that make sense? I mean, I want to be really careful there, because I think there's something really powerful about that. I've become very careful not to demonize anyone. And I recognize, I have friends who really hate Trump, and I say, every time you respond to Trump with hatred, you're doing exactly what he expects you to do. This is engineered. This is like, pay attention to what's happening beneath the surface. Don't simply respond from that reactive place. And really listen to the people who are hearing that message and saying yes to it. But I want to say it's tricky too, because there's something that happens where once pointed in that direction, there's the nuance is lost. Like you said, once that context is established, a lot of the complexity goes away. It's hidden behind that narrative. So it's question of how do we reopen that on all sides, kind of.
Yes, that is the question. How do we actually get the entire conversation to another level where we're not triggering these scripts? Because right now we're in script trigger world, and it's just going to keep bouncing back and forth. It isn't about the information. It isn't. I mean, it isn't about it. It's just about this kind of. It's about the context and the way that this information is being metabolized into the context. And the context is so divided and fractured and fragmented in so many directions that the old scripts are just, they're just feeding the divisiveness and kind of generating levels of bloodlust that are creepy, scary. That's, for me, that's the one thing that I really wish, this morning I opened my Twitter to all of this stuff about, the Iranians assassinating the president. And it's like, and then, hundreds of comments like, what is this? If you just like take a step back and look at it as information in motion, and how is that information circulating in the blood systems of these cultures? What's happening here? And I guess I am really concerned about the if I can say this, the ecology of the conversation. What is happening that is producing responses in different directions, and how can we sort of shift the inputs, or provide a different set of possibilities for what can be input to provide different responses. And so to me, that's along that same line of the question of where's the edge of my responsibility. We got to go to a place we haven't been before, because if we keep repeating the same scripts, we're going to keep getting polarized responses, and so is everybody else. There is no we and they here. That's just the nature of where we are right now, I think. part of the meltdown?
I don't know, I think sometimes it's over complexity. And I like to use sort of a thought experiment to imagine next year when the grid goes down and we're just here with our neighbors. We can't be communicating around the world. And what are our needs? We need to eat, we need to sleep, we need a roof over. I mean, they're really pretty simple. and somehow in all of this, I had started out with this real desire for like answers. And what should I do? Where do I go? How do I fix this? And now I'm sort of more in a place where I have the answers, and they're right here. They're right at my house. They're right at my neighbor's house. And that it's really as basic as doing what we've always done as humans. I mean, we've always been able to, in small groups and small tribes, we work together, we communicate with people we don't agree with. It doesn't have to be so complex. It seems like if we kind of go back to the basics and do it in a smaller groups and smaller connected nodes or something, that where it doesn't get to a point where you have these leaders who take advantage of it. If it's small enough and if it's um, contained enough, or not contained isn't the right word, if they're where it's just small enough where the people that you're working with, that you're dealing with, and it's not it might be achievable. And so it seems like at the same time you have to understand, which is what I listen to all kinds of podcasts and participate in these kinds of things, and I understand, but there's no real kind of connection coming out of that, which is what I now more than anything crave. Now I don't so much crave the answers. I crave the connection to other human beings who are sort of feeling the same thing as I'm feeling. I mean, real connections, not just, I mean, this is okay, but actually meeting and working alongside of, and I think that that's the answer. The more I've sort of learned, I think that's where the answer lies. How do we do that?
It surprises me how young people, but it's not isolated to just young people, think that they're the only ones thinking some of these things, and that they've got to join some online group like what we've got to be able to find the others. And I always have the sense, because we'll do meetups whenever we're traveling, that every place around the world, every single city that we've ever gone to has little groups of thinkers like this who are worried about these problems, or thinking about these things, and consuming a lot of the same content because it's the internet. And you can really like create meetup groups or join local meetup groups and find your tribe so much easier than people really think. And I agree with you. I think doing more locally would be a really great place to start.
I think so. I'm getting ready to roll this out next week, so I think I can mention it online. But we're starting a project, which is it's called People Need People, and it's just right in line with what you're talking about, John. But there's a little shift in there, which is that the idea is to use the sort of the Warm Data Lab process in various municipalities and locales around the world, to allow communities to, and we need to work on that word. It's not the right word. To allow people.
Which word isn't the right word?
Community isn't the right word. It's almost the right word, but it's not the right word because, first of all, it gets bumped into, either into the sort of, 60s, 70s commune concept, or into the legal, or political community, or, what it doesn't give me is the sense of people connecting from the inside. It's an outside word, and so what I'm talking about is more like compost. of, you know, people finding each other, like bacteria find each other in the soil. Like there's, you know, there's relationships that need to take place and things that need to happen to nourish the possibility world. And so the People Need People project is about not only bringing people together, but bringing people together to in their togetherness, use the warm data lab format, and in that process they actually develop relationships and community, but they're also developing capacity for perception and description of interdependency, right? Because, and that is as granular and intimate and personal as it is communal and global and biological. It goes beyond and beyond. So I think that has been really interesting, because I'm, you know, you let's see, it was David. You opened the question of how do you be the counterpart to a refugee, and I, you know, one of my sort of concerns around the romance around the local right now is that there's a lot of movement ahead. And how do we hold this, you know, deep connection to the land, and at the same time recognize there's a lot of people who are going to have to leave their land, and the land is changing. I just did a session in Western Australia, and there was an Aboriginal woman in the group who said, you know, we can't survive in the bush anymore because the biodiversity's gone. Right? So there's a shift there, and we are in a changing world. So what does it mean to have that kind of, those groupings of people who can be there for each other, and learn together in a changing world, and be able to be as local and in the detail as they are actually in the larger contexts as well. So it's an exciting project, and it's something that is kind of about essentially allowing people to go beyond their role, right? So all the people in a community, they all have their jobs and their roles, and when they get into this different sort of dialoguing and meeting and storytelling and warm dataing, that those roles begin to they change shape, and so that's exciting. But I just was thinking of it given what you said, because I'm seeing the same thing, that at some point it's really about the fact that we need each other. People need people, and
Yeah,
yeah.
I like the you had the hearing back the thing that I said. It's actually kind of like, how do I be a complement to the refugee? Like I heard someone say, there's a notion that collapse early, avoid the rush. Like there's some sense in my unsustainable life can't be sustained, and if I ignore it, I will be the refugee, right? It's kind of the same as the Jews in Germany. It's like, wait a minute, or you know, it's like, wait a minute, I didn't speak up when they came for them. Like, oh, wait a minute, I need to get involved early, not wait until I can't avoid getting involved, right? So the People Need People feels like a good response to that, getting involved now, when I still have choice in the matter, rather than waiting until I no longer do.
I think we all are. I think we all are involved early, and it's kind of moving to a place where, actually moving way faster than I expected it to. And I almost think that it's now moving to a place where I'm ready to, okay, do something concrete, something physical.
There's the work of Michael Mead in, he works with at-risk youth to do initiation ceremonies when they're at a place where they're ready to really change their life. And he creates what he calls instant community, which is, you can't do one of these milestone rituals to celebrate your entry or re-entry into society as a responsible man or woman. Or so you have to have that community or it's not a community ritual. And he just grabs everybody from all this different facets of their life, anybody who's interested in supporting them. And that community is probably never going to gather in that particular group of humans ever again. And that doesn't make it in any way less of a community. So I think there's something in that resilience, just recognizing that it's not going to be the same group of 8 people that shows up on a weekly basis. It's just life. The resiliency in nature doesn't work that way. And us trying to put it into a box that feels comfortable and like, oh, I'm going to know everybody that's there and we're going to have a chance to really get to know each other. Blah, that's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
Although it is what people crave, so you have to recognize that it's what people want, expect, or familiar with. So it has to be somehow addressed.
Hello.
Can't hear you, Mike.
Keep doing that. We can cut it into questions if you guys want. Questions that were kind of pre-sent to us. So if anyone wants to volunteer.
I'd volunteer. I sort of already asked mine, but I actually wanted to ask a follow-up.
Sure.
Just for a clarification. In terms of being in complexity or taking in information about complexity and then applying it with narrow motives, do you think that is somewhat stymied when we use processes that really feel into complexity? So when we de-intellectualize it and go into the poetry, is that a way that I think I'm just really hoping there's a way here where where this can't be used for evil. And yet I see I see the value, like really value of things like warm data, and I see these processes building into the future and new practices and really really strong ecologies developing around how we process this information and navigate in a changing world. And then I see how valuable that would be to the NSA and the CIA and the Iranian government and the Chinese. And, you know, is there any, maybe I'm answering my own question, but I'm hoping for some hope, I guess.
I think one of the issues is that there's a built-in prejudged outcome. And is it really possible to be working with complexity if you have a built-in prejudged outcome? And, I would like to think that my built-in prejudged outcomes are super good. And I can definitely say that I don't think Steve Bannon's are.
Right.
So that's just me. But what happens to your ability to respond to the complexity you're within if you have a goal? Right? So my father wrote about the difficulties of conscious purpose, which I have no business bringing up in a podcast like this, because this is a 3 or 4 hour discussion that, one doesn't just open, of the kind of difficulties that we can get into by thinking we know what's best and trying to produce those outcomes. And there's another way of looking at that. That's also called controlling or managing the complexity. And it's in that controlling and managing that trouble happens, because there's no possible way that you or I will ever be able to really perceive what we're controlling or managing and what the consequences of the consequences across contexts would be. So we may think, oh, but we know what is good and what is best, and we're going to do that thing. And I think that we have to be careful of that. That somehow that's kind of the precondition for stepping into this ring at all, is the sort of humility of not knowing. For me, that's my favorite thing about Warm Data Labs, is I have no idea what people are going to talk about, what's going to happen. I make the conditions, but what happens in there, I have no idea. So it's really alive. And that's so rich and so beautiful. You know, William Blake has this line that your comment reminded me of, where he says, a tear is an intellectual thing. Right. And I love that, because I used to use it as a sort of description of what I mean by transcontextual description. Because of course we know that a tear is an emotional thing. But where did those emotions come from? Ideas, disappointments, notions, right? So a tear is an intellectual thing and an emotional thing. But actually a tear is a physical thing. It's saline. It's a chemical thing. A tear is a communicational thing. It's a relational thing. Right? So that I would never want to separate the intellectualization of working with complexity from the poetry, from the actual hands-on daily grind of doing dishes and raising babies. You know, to me, that's one process. And we can pull them apart and see how they're related to each other, but the deep way in which all of those are intersteeped is critical. And you know, I think that it's important to recognize the integrity there, right? Because it's not an integrity that only counts in one context. It's got to be an integrity that counts in a lot of contexts. So so it's emotional rigor, it's cultural rigor, it's intellectual rigor, it's physical rigor, right? It's all of these things simultaneously. So that's where I would want to respond to you and just say, it's the control bit and the idea that we know what's best that's the trigger. It's not about separating the intellect from the poetry.
Thank you. That was really helpful.
It was a beautiful question. So that was a fun one.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
There's been a lot of talk and pattern in this conversation about stepping outside of our frames, and the ones that we're stuck in, especially, and seeing things in different contexts and from different perspectives. I wanted to ask you, what are some of your favorite questions, currently maybe, or all time, that can help people do that? Or what are some of your favorite exercises? Something that people can do on the spot, you know?
I'll give a shot at that, but I'd love to hear other people's inputs and questions and suggestions on that as well, because I love that that invitation. One thing is hang out with people who are from another culture, and pay attention, watch carefully, and I think that's, you know, sort of now more than ever, one of the most important things that any of us can do. And maybe even someone from another age group or another demographic. And it's not about, you know, making a list of the differences. It's about recognizing those things that confuse the hell out of you, where you thought one thing was going to happen and something else happened that didn't make any sense, that wasn't at all what you thought. That these kind of things that sneak in the side of our presumptions and assumptions, and the unspoken sort of web of matrixness that we're in, And those things are so valuable right now because they give us the tiniest peek outside our own fish tank. So that, for me, that's the big one. And you know, reading lots of different types of news. Don't let yourself get algorithmed in your life, in the social media world, but also in life. And I think those are important pieces. One thing for me, I live in Sweden, and I'm clearly not a Swede. I actually have a Swedish passport, but I'm an imposter. I'm from California, and that's just how that is. And I am every day up against these kind of moments where I actually have to say that I don't have any idea what's going on around me. And I feel like a little kid. I'm trying to figure out, what's happening. Was that a statement, or was that sarcasm, or was that an indication for, like, what are the cues? What's going on? And
Do you speak Swedish?
A little, not as
Do you
much as I
speak
should.
Swedish? No.
A little. But I find those moments to be uncomfortable, but not painful, just really disorienting. And I think that disorientation is very healthy. If we're talking about the possibility of systems change, that disorientation is essential.
Yeah, one of my favorite questions is what triggers me the most? And then I can follow up on that and ask, like, why is it triggering? And in what ways it might be true, in what ways the opposite is true. And yeah, there's always so much to unpack.
I like to play a game. I love that question, Yuvi. That was a good one. I like to play a game when I'm kind of outside at a coffee shop, people watching, and I just look at people and kind of watch their gait and the way they walk and what they're wearing. And I try and put myself into a place of knowing, of like building up, they can all be fictional, but building up previous life experiences to get me to be that exact person walking at that exact moment. And it's kind of just a fun little game I play when I'm on my own doing that, but it also works, and you can start testing it when you know someone and you get to see someone over and over again. So what story would make me behave in the exact way that you're behaving right now? And then I get to actually test whether my assumption was true or not, and like build that model out. It's been one of the most useful things for empathy. It's almost simulated empathy, but it's really worked for me.
That's perfect, because my question was, what assumptions am I making about this person? And you have to be really careful because people can take it super personal. So I always start with this disclaimer of like, I have this story about you, and my stories are almost never true, but I find that I have this story, and I'm going to stay stuck in it if I don't say it to the person it's about, so I can more deeply understand you. And then I say the thing, and it is almost never true. Or there might be a kernel of something in it. And sometimes I'm straight on, but in any case, it's always helpful to get my assumptions on the table and to learn what's really the case.
Mm-hmm. I think it's testable too. I mean, I think you can improve that ability. Like I've had a difficult time with the felt emotion of felt empathy. I guess I'm somewhere on a spectrum of low empathy. So once I've noticed I had a low amount of it, I decided to prioritize learning whatever I could to actually understand why people were feeling or acting in a certain way. And that testing component of it really worked, and was how I was able to kind of develop my own, it's real empathy now. It just, it really is real, but it had kind of an algorithm behind it. And I think it's that whole testing component of like, I think this is probably why you're acting this way, and then doing what you said to verbalize it, and then look for truth in that story, get the other person to give feedback.
I think I'm kind of in the same boat with that. I do have a tough time with connecting with my own emotions, and I've spent a lot of time working on that. I find I gravitate towards systems thinking in terms of how can we fix the system in order to make it so that this gets fixed. You know, this is just my standard procedure. And so as this conversation was going, I wrote up something to kind of keep, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, but what kind of a system can motivate people to help other people?
Hmm.
What are your thoughts on that? I don't know if that's.
I'm so glad you asked that question to Nora. Yeah. Nora is the perfect person to ask that too as well.
Yeah,
this is so good.
That summed up pretty well. I think it was, yeah.
There's, you know, I was talking about integrity earlier, and I think the sort of the companion to that kind of integrity that I'm talking about, which is, like I said, it's not about integrity of knowing right from wrong. It's about the integrity of paying attention to the interdependency and knowing that I don't know what will happen, right? I don't know. These questions that have just come in have been beautiful illustrations of what happens when you enter into complexity and you're willing to learn. And then the you know, I can't go in with a goal. I don't know what I'm going to do. There is no strategy, but there is preparation, deep, rigorous preparation. And that preparation is not just a preparation of how to. It's a preparation of familiarity, of where the impulse of how to and the perception of how to will come. It's at that next level back. And in that same zone, there's this generosity. What starts to happen with the sort of becoming more and more comfortable in that transcontextual space is that there's generosity there. You know, when you start to ask, well, but where's the health? Where is it? Where am I going to put how am I going to contribute to health? And it requires a different, a giving from a different place. It's not a generosity of altruism, right? The kindness that you're talking about is not the kindness that you get points in heaven for. It's the same kind of kindness that has to do with, you know, your heart sending blood all the way to your toes, right? It's not out of generosity or kindness or altruism that it does that. It does that because it's part of the system being alive. It's part of its own insight into its own aliveness. And it's a different kind of kindness. It's not a self-serving kindness, or generosity. But it's generated from another set of insights. So that's what I'm seeing, and that's why I was so inspired to do this People Need People project, because the integrity and the generosity that I'm seeing come out of that, of just what it occurs to you to do. You know, that's what I'm interested in, is not what do we do, but what does it occur to us to do? What are those impulses that sort of give that first hit of, well, we've gotta, and then ... what is that? And right now, the sort of the scaffolding around how we're sense making in fragmented, compartmentalized, you know, nation states, cultures, religions, age groups, economic, demographics, professions, etc., races, sexual preferences, whatever. Those containers are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And so, you know, how do we sort of enter back into the interdependency where the vitality of life itself actually is and contribute there. And that doesn't mean erasing any of those other aspects of our identities. They're not mutually exclusive. It just means that there's another kind of generosity. But I hope that made sense. But
That
that's what
did.
I'm
That was
seeing.
great. Yeah, I love that, and I actually love the way that you were saying, in the same way that, you know, the hand helps the foot, and that I've always thought, I've loved thinking about humans as being neurons in a bigger brain, and that's, you know, spot on to that kind of analogy. So thank you.
Thank you.
Is it possible to figure out another way? Like, you use the word incentivize. How do we incentivize people to act in a more altruistic way? I mean, where does incentivization fit in with that biological analogy?
I prefer insight to incentive any day of the week.
That's good.
Yeah. Incentive to me just like links us right back into all kinds of notions of kind of pooled material profit or status. And status and profit are really difficult to sort out because they're so connected.
Coming from working in blockchain a little bit, it just stinks of tokenized altruism.
Can you incentivize insight? Getting people to start thinking about things that challenge them, as opposed to going about their own everyday life. And
it's like incentivizing fun, you know, or you know, if you invite people to a party at your house, can you make an incentive to make them have more fun? Or what do? You don't incentivize fun, you create the conditions in which the fun is the consequence, right? It's a whole different approach.
Yeah, I like what you said. Invitation almost is more than, you know, is enough of the incentive. People show up, but not a rewarding for the participation, just making the invitation, you know, known.
You can you can model things and thereby give people permission. A lot of what doesn't happen is because people don't think they have permission to. The problem with incentives is that if people are not intrinsically motivated to do the thing, they will stop doing it as soon as the incentive goes away. And that's not the kind of deep change that I think we're all looking for. So you can change the environment. That's the most powerful thing to do. Chip Heath has a great book called Switch that talks about behavior change. And we tend to think of it from this sort of individual willpower, but that's actually the least powerful thing.
Right.
He uses elephant, rider, and path. So the rider is the mental, the intellect, the willpower. And then the elephant is the emotional body. So that's where my work is, in healing the emotional body. What are the conditions within an individual that would allow them to fully be present to all the options that are in every moment? And the reason we don't do that is because of unhealed trauma. To give it a very simplistic gloss, there's many reasons, but that's one of them. And then the greater environment, the physical environment, the cultural environment, changing those is obviously the biggest thing, but you can change the environment in your own home. You can change it in the events and the containers that you create. And you can model that permission, at least in the context of one room, which is how it starts.
I like to do that also in terms of mutual learning, you know, allowing conversations and interactions that include learning mutually. And I think that's especially important across generations. But in any circumstance, you know, mutual learning changes the way that you do the interaction and what's possible, right? You know, that there's like, we're not actually communicating based on what it is we want to say or do. We're communicating based on what we think it's possible to say in this conversation. and who it's possible to be and how it's possible to say those things. So yeah, so I think that modeling that opens it up of just, what does it look like to learn? What does it look like to reveal your complexity so that somebody else can reveal theirs? And I think it's a form of respect and generosity and integrity to do that. Where incentive, I think the other problem with incentive is just that it's just part of the wrong world. It's just leading us back into that notion of reward, and then accumulated reward, and that becomes status. And that's not going to help, because, like you said, there's plenty of people who just opt out, and actually they're the ones that you want to have in the most, and that have the most to contribute. But if you get points by being contributors, and the points are what people are after, then you're only going to generate people who want to get more points. So that's a problem.
But what if, see, that's where I'm stuck at, is like, let's say this system itself, to get people into your warm data labs, or to get people participating in this system itself is such an amazing system. And it's like, you wish that more people would be able to do this. I wish I could go and do this tomorrow with all of my friends, and we can all go and do this. What if, like, you could give all your friends a lottery ticket or something that would, hey, like, go do this. You'll get X if you go and do this. And then you find out, oh my gosh, this is something that was incredible. This was such a rewarding experience. I want to keep doing this. In the same way that you have a lawnmower and you have to start the engine. That extrinsic motivation to start the engine of the intrinsic thing. If the system is right, if the system was a strong enough system to keep people in it, like, how we're stuck on our phones because there is some type of reward that got us, that I guess it's just a system. I don't know. That's kind of where I'm stuck, is to use that kind of lawnmower analogy of, like, starting this, what can start people's attention to get into a system that is like that. I don't know.
How can we
I have a,
compete?
I have a thought that is kind of an interesting notion, which is we already are in one.
Mm.
So it's recognizing the one that we're already in. And that's why I liked the invitation, is because it's looking in a place where you overlooked before, that's already inside, right? That's the intrinsic part of it's there. There's something that I've noticed recently. I've been thinking about that, the notion, Chris Beasley and I have talked about this a little bit, about the notion of boundary versus membrane. Like in a cell, the membrane is a living thing, and the membrane's where the intelligence is. That's the interface between the outside and inside, and it's a semi-permeable. And in some sense, the more that I think about it, with cells working together, they can form organs and organisms and communities. And so in a way, the membrane is holographic as well. It has scale, and it's sort of the inside and outside connect. It's a kind of a Klein bottle. I mean, it's a mathematical metaphor, but it kind of makes sense that it's not, the flow's not always open or closed. It's not about containing something. It's about noticing, where am I missing? If this is the thing that I notice, is that there's something about, how am I missing the part of me? What am I overlooking? And the notion of incentive really brings an interesting question, is it focuses me to look for the answer outside, up there somewhere, like, oh, somewhere out there is the answer. And I overlook all of the information in here that's telling me, there's the pain that I'm feeling is actually beautifully connected to exactly what I need, if I only will listen to what I'm actually experiencing. rather than trying to fix it, to actually listen to it. It's a very different experience.
I guess the rewards that you get from incentives, you know, if you kind of look at the pattern of what those are, they're not really what we're looking for. So I guess it's maybe easiest just to look at the things that we don't have incentive for and think about what's happening there, and maybe start to feel the difference a little bit. What are those things? And I think, you know, that kind of ties into, John, what you were saying about our people next door. They're just there. Change just happens. It just is. We just are. Life just is living. That's just, there's so much that just is. And you know, being in an incentivized position is about moving that needle into another sort of forced space. And I don't know that we need to do that. In fact, what I think that, you know, what David, you were saying was kind of what's already here, that's already happening that we're not seeing. And that's such a great question, because that's what's happening in the natural world. It's just naturing, right? It's just happening. Life is just systeming and complexifying. It's just doing it. So what is it? You know, is the earthworm incentivized to fertilize the soil?
Well, yeah. Then, you know, I would say we need the earthworms to fertilize the soil, but right now the earthworms are on their phones playing Angry Birds, and it's like, how do we get them to not do that? Like, I don't. It almost seems as if you need an incentive to take out incentives.
Now there's a paradox, right?
You know, it's like a you got to fight fire with fire, and then, like, I'm just imagining each agent as someone who has the potential to blossom into this beautiful thing, and yet they're stuck doing these things that are never going to get them to where they need to be. And like, I just got lucky in that my culmination of my life just so happened to make me kind of wake up and be like, oh my gosh, look how connected I am to all these other people. Like, how can I help all these other people do these things and make us all kind of be a greater unit and function well together? But that's just like what brought me to that point. How can we bring more people to that point? And a lot of that's just work, self-work. But can we incentivize people to work on themselves? I mean, I don't know. I'm just throwing things out here.
Do you have kids?
No, I don't.
I had this great moment with my kid once. I have tons of kids. And I can tell you that incentivizing stuff with kids, heads up, Mike, forget it. Just don't even start with that. If your sentence starts with if you, then.
But I have this whole spreadsheet, incentivization, reward system ready for my child. I've been working on it for months.
So once I asked my son to, you know, that naggy mom thing, can you take the trash out? And I had, you know, kind of been waiting for him to do it, and he didn't do it. And I was, you know, trying to not be naggy, but it happened anyway. And he turns to me and he goes, yeah, I'd be happy to take the trash out. Just give me about a half an hour to forget you asked me and let me think it was my idea. And then
wow.
And, you know, like, there it is, right?
And yet, if you never
Sure.
asked, he would never take it out.
Or would he? Like, I will never know,
Yeah.
right? Or how do you, it's a very delicate invitation. And fortunately, I had a kid who was willing to, that was a pretty clear answer. You don't get that. That's a kid that understands systems thinking right there. Right? So he out systems thought me. Yeah, pretty great. But yeah, how to make a space for this to happen, because I think that's what we're really talking about. I don't think there's a really I'm very kind of nervous about the idea of changing the way people think. I don't really feel like that's my prerogative. It's not my territory. I have a real hesitation around that. But I can make a space where it's possible to think in another way, and then see what happens. And all I can say is that so far, it's certainly been very magnetic, and that's great. So I'm going with that until I run out of steam or something happens. But people like to play. They like to experiment. They like to be heard. They like to be in connection. And I think, that these things have preyed upon all of those tendencies. And so, but it was a synthetic connection. It was a synthetic playing. It was a synthetic relationship. And so, that there's something else entirely in people keep asking, when are you going to make a technology so we can do warm data online? And it's like, no, I'm not gonna, because we need to be able to hear the laughter on the other side of the room. We need to be able to share whatever temperature we're in together. We need to be able to sense and feel into what is, the smells, the different emotions in the room, the cadences and the resonances of different people's voices in different places, how their cheeks warm up, or their sweat glands open, or their, all these things we don't know that we're paying attention to, but we are. And there's ancient communication processes in there. And there's some kind of craving for that to have a space, to have a place. And so, I like to go on my phone and write messages to my friends, but then I like to be in real communication too. So it's not really about an either or thing. It's about what can give us what. Where can we go for what kind of what kind of nourishment? Or
my immediate thought when you were saying that was, oh, sorry, when not bringing warm data online, but that, like, what if it was more known and organized to all other people? Like, I could find a warm data lab right next door to me, and I
That's
could go there
okay.
tomorrow.
And you could do that part online. You could find
Right.
the warm data lab online, but you'd go to it.
Right. That's where my head's thinking is, like, how do we incentivize people to look and find the warm data lab that's next door to them online? That kind of, yeah. I changed my sentence. Oh,
I get from listening to you, Jared, I get kind of a sense of urgency that you feel.
Yeah.
That they're, that they have atom bombs. We need atom bombs, because we're not going to be able to compete you know, because they have this tool that, or this weapon that's so powerful, how can we possibly compete with it? And I guess, you know, if you look at the source at incentivize, I mean, encourage, you know, there's all sorts of other words. I mean, basically prepare the field for planting so that people will plant, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, as opposed to making them, you know, and like, that's sort of what we have to do. And I think that the whole, it's really an addiction, sort of using addictions to drive what somebody decides is the right direction, drive people what somebody decides is in the right direction, I think is probably the wrong approach. Certainly for me, the wrong approach is like understanding it and doing the hard work that is required to sort of do it a different way, you know. Unfortunately, it isn't going to, and the other thing is just being responsible, because when you're talking about incentivizing and like using like telephones, it's like you're giving the responsibility for these changes to something else, to an algorithm or to someone else to make the decision, as opposed to basically, you know, confronting people or, you know, doing the hard work yourself. And it just, there isn't any fast way. Hopefully there'll be a point, you know, like where a tipping point before the grid goes down, hopefully.
I face this problem a bit with the content that we create in Future Thinkers. Like there's this sort of back of the mind desire to design the perfect piece that everyone loves and everyone wants to share. But then there's also this idea of like creating a live stream and maybe touching 20 people and just having it kind of go from the bottom up instead of designing the perfect thing from the top down. I feel like there's kind of a directionality element to this that we haven't really talked about. And I think John points at it by talking about your urgency. It's like you feel this urgency that we all have to start doing something. And therefore we need a system that will perfectly integrate everyone in now, you know, instead of just doing, and this is why I was excited for you to ask this question to Nora, because what Nora brought up in our podcast interview of like wanting to go to just tiny little communities and work from the bottom up and get people excited just face to face about making change. I always felt where you were coming from. And it's people like Nora and UV actually who has kind of converted me over to the other side.
Yeah, I definitely feel the sense of urgency. There's no question. I feel the sense of urgency too. I think we all do. But then you have to sort of stop and say, well, you know, where is the edge of my responsibility? I mean, is it really realistic to come up with this sort of, I don't know, answer that will sort of pull us all back together again? And I don't think that really is.
Well, I think it's a dangerous thing to come up with a formula. I mean, you know, that notion of a formula is really close to colonialism. And that's again, that urgency can really mix dangerously with a need to control or make change. And it's exactly that impulse that is what's getting us into the trouble to begin with. So, you know, this sort of recognition of, you know, we started off talking about Bannon, and one of the things that he really got is that that culture comes before politics. If you you know, shift the culture, the policy will follow. Shift the policy without the culture, and there's just go-arounds.
Then you have to make rules. Then you have to make camps.
Rules for the rules, right? and so it's not about making better rules. It's about you know, what has been lurking in the back of my mind in this whole conversation is the prisoner's dilemma. And you know, the prisoner's dilemma is is such an important piece. I'm assuming that you're familiar with it, sort of the game theory piece. And one of the things is that there's an underlying question. And the underlying question is, what world do we live in? Do we live in a world in which I trust you to trust me? Are we really there for each other deep down? Like, where are we really? And so for me, one of the things that I am concerned about right now is some kind of tearing in that fabric. That there's been so much divisive talk, and that the information scape has been so steeped in cruelty in all directions. You know, no one's innocent. There's no left and right that's more innocent there. But the cruelty itself is what's concerning me, because it kind of comes back to the aesthetic, and what is the deep underlying aesthetic of the world that we share. So I think for me, that's where it matters. You know, what we type in those comment boxes. Maybe we should get rid of comment boxes. I don't know how to deal with comment boxes, because you write something and then people either agree or disagree, or they say something that's kind of an agreement or a disagreement, and it turns into a binary, and somehow it becomes very difficult to be in a real, to have any kind of real ecology in the communication. It just spoils it somehow. So I guess I'm deeply concerned about what each of us is, you know, with our little dropper full of communication in a day. What are we putting into that fabric of the overall shared sense of what world we live in? Is it a benevolent world? Is it a beautiful world? Is it a playful world? Is it a caring, generous world? What world is it? And it's, you know, I guess much more than all the strategy and all of that, for me, one of the things I'm I think working on is that tone, that underlying tone. You know, when you're in a conversation with someone and the tone has a particular edge to it, you know what you can't say, where you're not safe. And so you might not go there, or you might provoke it, but either way, you're in response to it, right? You're not outside it. So what can we put in that deeper aesthetic to kind of address that prisoner's dilemma question of, can I trust you to trust me? And so I don't know, that's, for me, that's a big piece of this.
I just want to weave together, there's been several different threads that are all kind of coming together, and I don't quite know how to start. But I think it starts in Jared's, what I heard in your body language, in your tone of voice that you didn't say in your words, was that urgency and impatience. And you said you were lucky that you found this awakening. You didn't say that word either, but this different way of thinking. And for me, I don't feel like I was lucky that I found this other way of interacting with the world, and that I found the beauty and the trust that Nora is talking about. I believe a quote from Neelam, which is, pain pushes until love pulls. And for me, that's the intrinsic motivation. And we have to be really careful with incentivizing things that people are intrinsically motivated to, because it actually has a disincentivizing effect in some cases. There's been studies, like if you give monetary stipends or rewards for kidney donation, that the people who are intrinsically motivated to do kidney donation will actually be less likely. If your romantic partner offered to give you money for sex, you would probably think there was something really badly wrong. You know, like if someone tried to pay you for cooking them chicken soup when they were sick because you were their best friend, it's like there's this weird disincentivizing thing that just rings incorrectly because it's incorrect. It actually is incorrect. And I think that's where we're at with it. And I deeply think that the answer to your question is about trust. To trust that the people that you think or you're holding a concern, I think, that that if we don't hurry up and fix the system, that these people won't get to a better place, that the world won't get to a better place, and some catastrophe that shouldn't happen is imminent. And my foundational belief that I don't know if it's true, but I know my life is radically better and works better on every level when I believe it's true, is that everyone is whole, creative, and resourceful. And if I try to do their sense making for them, I am radically off track. Like therein lies all sorts of crazy power games and colonialism and codependency, and like every kind of evil comes to the surface when you think that you can do someone else's sense making better than they can for them. So I definitely feel some urgency. There's like a healthy kind of urgency that motivates productive action. But if I'm not grounded in the fundamental trust that the universe has this handled and this big complex system has a wisdom way bigger than me, I can get really off track. And lastly, I just want to tie it back to what Heather said, because I just made this card last night, which has hope on one side, and what's deeper than hope is trust. My favorite quote about hope is a fragile thing. The more you look to it, the less beautiful it becomes. And what's deeper than hope is trust. The deep bone knowing that something bigger, the big complex system that is the universe has this handled, and that it indeed is going to create all the urgency that it needs, whether that be through pain or whether it be drawing someone forward through love, which is the path that we would all prefer, but we all had to come through the pain. So I just have to trust it. It's a crazy way that things work, but it's beautiful, and I am never going to understand it. I will only ever get to witness it.
That
Well
was awesome.
said. Yeah.
Thank you, Krista.
I want to touch base with something that came up in the chat, in the YouTube chat. Someone, Stephanie, mentioned that it's difficult to trust if there's no acknowledgement for harm done to others. And I think that this is absolutely critical. And I'm so glad that she brought it up, so that it doesn't just kind of get, we don't just march along this merry path of talking about this without acknowledging that in the existing systems, it is actually not possible to live without harming others. And this is something that I think is sort of, to me, is the ultimate reveal of the failure of our institutional processes, is that, you know, my kids are asking me, I think this came up in our podcast,
Yeah.
you know, my kids are asking me how to be a good person when everything that they do connects them to the harm of others and the you know, biosphere that we live in. And so, you know, what does it mean to then be, you know, having those questions that you're, you know, that you're bringing in, Crystal, around hope and trust, when the systems that we are within are leaving us dressed in blood, You know, how did my breakfast cereal get brought to the grocery store? How did my clothes get made? How did the paint get made that's on my walls? How did right? There's no way out. It's just everywhere. And so that question of the edge of my responsibility, you know, there it is again. And I just want to acknowledge that and acknowledge it at a deeply personal level of recognizing that these past several hundred, maybe thousands of years have brought us to this point where there's so much damage done. And even though I could say, yeah, but I didn't do it, and the stuff I did do, I didn't mean to do. I didn't know how to not do it. You know, I could actually say those things. I could believe those things. But the fact of the matter is that I am in it, and I have benefited from it. I have. You know, the comfort that I live in is, even though my own family has worked hard toward bringing interdependency into view in Western civilization for at least 3 generations, I'm still in it. So I think that that's an important piece to bring in here, not because there should be some guilt or shame, but because that can also go sour. But because there needs to be acknowledgement. We need to say, okay, you know, here we are. And there's no point in denying it or painting some other picture of it. It's just what it is. And while I have benefited, there are many who have been traumatized across generations. So that's what's real. What am I going to do with that? How am I going to rectify that? How do I fix that? Well, I mean, the one thing I can do first of all is just admit, just acknowledge, and not try to hide or justify. And then we take it from there. So I just want to bring that in because I feel that it would be distasteful not to.
Yeah, but from my experience, like the most transformational experiences started when somebody put some trust in me before I deserved it, like before I was capable of acknowledging all the harm that I've done and all the things that I like have done poorly because I didn't know any better. So like the trust first. And like one of my favorite examples is like a team lead at a previous job. Like he gave me promotion even though I didn't qualify for that. And then he told me like, I know you're capable of doing this. So I'm giving you this promotion and I know you'll meet all the requirements in 6 months. And I did it in 3 because somebody saw that thing in me that I haven't yet seen before. And I don't feel like there is any other way but to trust people before they've proven that they deserve it.
It all makes me think of the beautiful thing you said, Nora, in the Future Thinkers podcast about how whatever the solution is, it has to conform exactly to the shape of the problem. And so every answer has to be just as complex as the question that it's trying to solve. And the quote there's a quote that keeps coming to mind. I think it is be careful when you have a hammer because every problem looks like a nail, right? It's like we have ways of solving things, and so we think we know what the problems are, but we maybe don't know it all, and we need to put down the hammer and look at what's actually here.
Yeah. You know, in this moment of urgency, it is really tempting to go swiftly, strongly forward. But in this moment of urgency, it is absolutely imperative to pay attention in ways we've never paid attention before. So it's like running through a forest that you don't know where the sticks and stones and stumps are in the dark, and we have to pay attention, but keep moving.
I know that we're like right at I think we're at the end of the time, and this isn't going to be possible to really address this, but the thought of children and incentivizing, and the question of that and education comes up, and I think about Greta Thunberg and like there's something of actually being with the questions and not using them as hammers, really just trying to engage fully in that, and the recognition that listening to our children for a generation probably would be so much more beneficial than trying to any of the fixes that we could institute. It's something in listening to the children that is listening to us as well, right? It's like I took a class with someone a while back who said, "Oh, the young people have to understand the wisdom of the elders," and I think what we forget is that the elders have to listen to the wisdom of the children as well.
Back to the Jared's incentivizing and that part of the conversation. One of the tools that we have in our toolbox is what Nora was just saying, acknowledgement. So when someone does something and has not been incentivized, then it's probably really important to acknowledge it and be grateful for that, and to point it out and to thank them, because that can be very powerful, and as powerful as hopefully as powerful as incentives.
Gratefulness is such a massive factor. There's so many studies about gratefulness and how it affects the human body, and how it's such a powerful thing. So I love that. I also wanted to make a point. I'm making a change to my sentence that I like to just kind of meditate on these sentences, just to keep myself, like, it's like a little thing I do. But how can we make it easier for people to help other people? Not motivate people, but make it easier for people to help other people. What are your thoughts on that?
I have mixed thoughts on that. Part of me is ready to kind of move with the natural way in which, if things want to happen, they start to happen, right? Okay, fine. Another part of me says, yeah, but it's really important to be willing to do the hard work. And so this easy thing kind of scares me into the fast food version of how to go forward with this. And I don't really want the fast food version. I want the rich and beautiful and multi-dimensional, multi-textured, the depth and the history and the warmth of that, because I'm like I said, sort of at the beginning, I'm so worried about these superficial solutions, and that the urgency to generate hope becomes this superficial hope is better than no hope at all. And it isn't better than no hope at all. It's actually better to be hopeless and find each other in that hopelessness and generate creativity and generate new questions and work through it than not. So I want it to be available. I don't want it to get squashed by the existing system. I don't want to, be constantly shut down in the Kafka story of trying to, make the case for why we need to provide the possibility for systems to learn and to change without KPI deliverables. Like I'm so tired of that fight. But at the same time, so in that sense, I want it to be easier, because that's an unnecessary, like I said, kind of Kafka-esque version. But I do want there to be the hard work and the depth.
I'll offer you my mantra, which is about trust, which just came to me a couple days ago, and it is, there is no better there than here. And I'm asking the universe to teach me that in every moment of uncertainty where I lose track of that trust, to really look around and go, how could this possibly be the best solution? Because I do believe in every moment that what's present, the resources, the emotions, the everything, if I'm by myself, I'm in a huge group, looking around and going, okay, this is the most ideal solution for this moment, because if there was something better, I trust the universe would have provided that. And then getting really curious about what is present. And I think it is helpful for me because it's mostly an internal question, and it challenges me to notice what's working well. And once I notice what's working well, then I can provide that gratitude and appreciation. But if I'm so stuck in, oh my God, how can this be different? Why isn't this different? I overlook everything that's right about the moment. And when you put your attention and awareness into what's actually working, that grows. Wherever your awareness is, that quality is growing. So like over and over and over this year, my plan is to deepen my trust and to recognize what actions are happening that are promoting the kind of healing that I want to see in the world. And then I can actually do something with it because I've seen it. And if I haven't seen it, then I can't help it get bigger. So.
Thank you, Crystal. That helps me a lot, because it's also, it's that kind of presence and being grounded in right here, right now is something I'm trying to kind of embody. I mean, I've for the longest time never really dealt with the here and now. I'm always thinking about the future, how things could be, the better ways that, just because of my history and my past, but taking that time to be present, be mindful, and learn if right now, what can I extract out of this situation and take it in. It's a really great perspective. So thank you.
I think it's really important to also keep in mind that there's a lot of destruction and really, really deep injustice, and that those circumstances in which we're kids are in trouble, and people who are dealing with the sort of increase in mental health sufferings, and the people who are losing their homes, and that there's I think it's important to not forget that there's there's a way of being grateful that also acknowledges that this has come at a cost, and I don't think that it's a good idea to forget about that. I mean, if anything, I want to remember it. It's interesting because there's so, in my life, given whatever the demographics that I am in, I can have linear goals and they work out. Go to school, get good grades, work your butt off, get an entry position, and you can find your way to the top or the middle, and you'll get something out of the system. But there's, most of the world isn't living in a reality where that linearity works. You can get really good grades and you can work really hard and you can still end up with nothing and be caught. And so, when we were talking earlier about the ways in which I'm perceiving that that people who have had the least amount of incentives granted by the system have the greatest amount of capacity for complexity thinking. So I just want to bring us back to that because, sometimes I think one of the traps that we can fall into is this notion of finding solutions, which is of course a linear concept. And what does a response? What's the difference between a solution and a response? If we're going to sort of go into those semantics, so that we're not looking to solve something, but how to respond to the complexity with the complexity needed. So that I think that quote you were getting at was that the shape of the response needs to meet the shape of the trouble. Yeah, and I just wanted to put that in there because it's really easy to get lost in a particular culture.
Guys, this has been a lot of fun, very insightful, and thank you all for participating and contributing. Thank you to the chat as well for all the awesome questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of it, but yeah, it's been great reading through it. And Nora, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's been just great. And what a fantastic group, and the chat group is great too. I just wanted to also say, if you're interested in that People Need People thing, just keep an eye out in my various, actually, maybe I'll send stuff to you and UV, Mike, and then it can go into.
We'll put it in the description, and we'll probably retweet and all of that stuff too. But it'll be in the description of this video within whenever we get it from you.
Okay, we'll be unrolling it sometime in the next couple weeks. So
cool.
And the more the merrier. People need people.
Is there a website that people can go to just when it comes out?
I'll give you all that.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, but thanks everybody.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.